Murder and manslaughter, the most serious crimes people can commit. Police departments around the world are working on solving as many of these crimes as possible, but there are many unreported cases that go undetected. To change that, scientists and police investigators are perfecting a new range of astonishing methods, because these crime fighters have one thing in common. Their work starts when someone else's life ends. A graphic design student is killed in Hanau, Germany. Milestones in DNA analysis will help to find her killer. California. Investigators have been looking for a serial killer for more than 40 years. What will the role of genealogy be in solving the case? Carol Daly was promoted to chief investigator of the Sacramento police due to a serial killer in the 1970s.
Consciously, the East Area rapist never left my thoughts all of those years.
Harald Schneider, his specialty, DNA analysis.
I believe that it is impossible to commit a crime without leaving traces at the scene.
Schneider takes advantage of the rapid progress in analysis methods. He extracts DNA from the smallest amounts of trace evidence. At the beginning of the 1990s, Harald Schneider started a project that was to become his life's work. The genetic fingerprint was the latest tool for investigators. At the State Office for Criminal Investigation in Hessen, Germany, the Forensic Institute is established with Harald Schneider as its head. In the 90s, the molecular biologist was fascinated by the new methods for DNA analysis.
That's the way it was. I had just finished university. I studied molecular biology and didn't really know too much about genetic fingerprints. Then there was this article in Nature that was about this topic and that grabbed my interest and got me started. And, as you can imagine, no one had been doing this kind of thing, and that was exciting, a bit like the gold rush. It meant everything you did also worked, and suddenly you had a lot of opportunities to approach cases you had never even thought could be solved. That was a great time. In particular, the first 5 to 10 years. Absolutely great.
At the beginning, they were a team of 3. Today, Schneider has the support of more than 40 employees. Schneider is head of the most modern DNA lab in Europe. He and his team have helped solve more than 550 murder cases with their analysis. Among them, a number of cold cases, where the perpetrator had already eluded the authorities for a long time. Boston, Massachusetts. The city is also called the Cradle of Liberty. The flames of the American Revolutionary War ignited here in 1775. Boston University. Their academic program offers a Master of Science degree in forensics with applications in crime fighting. Boston University is one of only a few universities nationwide where forensics is taught. The distinctive thing about the program in Boston is that the focus is on forensic medicine. Molecular biologist Robin Cotton is director of the program. Her expertise has been requested in more than 200 court cases in the United States. The most prominent, the O.J. Simpson case.
No matter where you come from, you share greater than 99.99% of your DNA with every other person on the planet. But that little tiny bit that's different from person to person obviously accounts for physical differences, but there are also internal differences in the molecule that we can test for. And so we're not looking, at least for the moment, we're not looking at physical differences. There are a few tests for that, but commonly used DNA tests in crime labs all over the world do not look at physical differences. And we're looking at molecular differences that exist in a large number of places on the DNA, and they will tell us. They can differentiate family members and basically everybody except identical twins.
Deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA for short, is the substance where our human genome is stored. Every cell in the human body contains the unique composition of our DNA. The biomolecule is the carrier of hereditary information in all living things. Normally, the DNA comes in the shape of a double helix. It changes the conventional fingerprint into a genetic one. Whenever we touch something, we leave a print of the ridges on the soft part of our fingertips. Fingerprints. They are unique, even in identical twins. The development of the friction ridges is an embryonic process that leads to different results. In the 19th century, fingerprints were used for the first time to help identify a perpetrator. A female perpetrator, to be precise. June of 1892 near Buenos Aires. A 6-year-old boy and his 4-year-old sister are found dead in their house. Apparently, the killer also went after the mother. She had cuts on her throat. Inspector Alvarez detects a spot of dried blood at the crime scene with a fingerprint on it. Alvarez requests the help of an officer from the state police. Ivan Vucetic has an interesting theory. No two fingerprints are alike. He examines the print on the bloodstain and compares it to the fingerprints of the mother. The samples are a match. Francisca Rocha has been caught. She confesses to having killed her children and self-inflicting the wounds on her throat. She says her children were in the way of her wedding plans.
The classic fingerprint was the logical development where, for the first time, one could clearly identify people, a technique of individualization, and that was your classic fingerprint, the friction ridge pattern. And when this technology entered forensics, there was, for the first time, the possibility to connect an offender unmistakably to a crime scene and thus to solve serious crimes. It was a revolution in forensic science.
The term DNA appears in scientific literature for the first time at the end of the 1920s. Phoebus Levine described a substance which is part of our chromosomes. It is made up of sugar molecules, phosphates, and 4 so-called bases. However, Levine's publication on DNA is forgotten again until the early 1950s. In 1953, the researchers James Watson and Francis Crick succeed in unraveling the structure of the DNA. They present a model of the genetic material for the first time. 1962, they are awarded the Nobel Prize for their work. 12 years after Watson and Crick received the Nobel Prize, a horrific crime spree starts in California. In those days, Carol Daly is one of the few women at the Sacramento Police Department. These crimes will be with her for the rest of her life. It's the early 70s. A series of rapes sends shockwaves through the community of Sacramento. Fear and confusion abound. Were all these crimes committed by the same person? A young woman is entrusted with solving these crimes, Carol Daly.
Once we realized that this was a series going by the same person, the task force was organized and the same people responded to every case. So everybody was working together, collecting evidence, talking to the neighbors, talking to the victim, taking the reports, and then at the same time, the criminalist overseeing the collection of the evidence. We had a very large team. I think at one point, we had at least 20 people who were responding at one time to make sure that everything was done right.
The media quickly come up with a moniker for the man terrorizing the population of the presumably safe suburbs of Sacramento County, the East Area Rapist. Decades later, it comes to light that he was active all over California between 1976 and 1986. He is suspected of at least 12 murders and 45 rapes. Citrus Heights, a town in Sacramento County, California. It is 6:30 in the morning of October 5th, 1976. The 30-year-old Jane C. is in bed cuddling with her 3-year-old son. Her husband has just left the house. Then she hears a noise in the hallway. Decades later, Carol Daly revisits the crime scene.
We're standing in front of Jane Carson's house, who was victim number 5 on Wood Parkway. The rapist went, we don't know whether he went over the front fence or a back fence, but he entered through a side window on the other side of the fence, on the side where the driveway is, and made entry into the home.
The perpetrator locks her son into the bathroom and rapes Jane C.
After she realized that the rapist had left, it was quite a while. When she heard no more noises, she was able to work the blindfold down so she could see where she was going, and she had to hobble out the side door and yell for a neighbor to come and help her. And the neighbor took her to their house, and that was where I met her when I arrived at the scene.
Back then, Carol Daly is the only woman on the investigation team, and only one of the few women at all in the police department. She becomes the person that victims trust. The women talk to her about what happened, a very important skill for her superior officers. She is promoted to chief investigator in the case. It will take another 40 years before she learns that the East Area rapist and another serial killer on the loose in California, the so-called original Night Stalker, are one and the same. Back to Wiesbaden. Together with 3 colleagues, molecular biologist Harald Schneider built up the Department for DNA Analysis at the Institute for Forensic Medicine of the State Office for Criminal Investigation in Hesse. Today, 60 specialists and scientists work in the expert group. 7 years prior to opening the department, a groundbreaking discovery from Great Britain made the news. In 1984, the British geneticist Alec John Jeffreys was researching genetic diseases. For this purpose, he took blood samples from members of the same family. Jeffrey found out that each and every one of them has a specific and unique genetic barcode that is different from anybody else's in the world. He calls his discovery genetic fingerprinting. The individual lines reminded the researcher of fingerprints. To this day, every genetic fingerprint used in solving a crime or in a paternity test is based on variations discovered by Jeffreys. In 1983 and 86, 2 women were found raped and murdered in the British county of Leicestershire. A DNA mass screening by court order is carried out. However, the perpetrator Colin Pitchfork is not among those tested. He paid somebody to take the test for him. This man boasted in a pub that Colin Pitchfork had paid him £200 to take the test for him. The woman who overheard the conversation reports it to the police. Pitchfork is arrested, and his DNA matches the 2 samples taken at both crime scenes. In 1987, 3 years after the discovery by the geneticist Jeffreys, a murderer is convicted by his genetic fingerprint for the very first time. The world's first case solved with the help of DNA analysis. But in Germany at the end of the 80s, the labs were not quite up to speed yet. Hanau, Germany, the 20-year-old Sabine S. has only been living here for a few months. She moved to this place to start her studies at the renowned Academy for Art and Design. On the morning of September 26th, she leaves her apartment in a hurry. She takes a shortcut to the Academy through a tunnel under the train tracks. And this is where Sabine S. meets her murderer. Many years later, the results of the DNA analysis in Sabine S.'s case will help catch her killer. But DNA evidence cannot solve every case. There is one distinction between a genetic fingerprint and the conventional one. While a print from the friction edges of a finger is different for everyone, even identical twins, their genetic barcode is exactly the same. The most famous such case, the spectacular Berlin KDW department store heist in January of 2009, where millions of dollars worth of watches and jewelry were stolen. The police found traces of DNA on a glove at the crime scene. These traces led to identical twins, but whose DNA was it? The trace evidence could not be exactly attributed to either of them with 100% certainty. The investigators had to let the suspects go. Thanks to developments in DNA analysis, cold cases where none of the leads ever panned out can now be reopened. Prerequisite: the investigators had the foresight to collect DNA at the crime scene or from the dead body.
The Sabine S. murder case was special for us in that it was the first cold case solved by us here in Hesse. It was the first cold case nationwide and probably also in Europe, and it was solved 11 years after the crime. Why? Because it was only 11 years after the crime that we had the adequate methods of DNA analysis to solve this crime.
The graphic design student Sabine S. was on her way to the academy on September 26, 1989. She never arrived there. The next day, when a railroad worker steps away to relieve himself in the undergrowth near the tracks, he makes a horrible discovery: the dead body of Sabine S. under a tarp. The perpetrator bashed in her skull. Later examination detects traces of semen on the body of the young woman. In Germany, collecting genetic fingerprints is not part of standard investigatory procedure in the late 80s. The police investigations hit a dead end. The chief of the homicide division in Hanau police force puts the file to the other cold cases, but the investigators pin their hopes on future technologies. They take samples from the crime scene and store them in the evidence room.
If you have a capital crime, say murder, all evidence from a victim is kept for all eternity. Everything. Small box is stored in the evidence room, done.
19 months after the crime, in May of 1991, the police asked the viewers of an Unsolved Crimes TV show for their help, without success. At the same time, Harald Schneider started his work at the Forensics Institute. The possibilities of DNA analysis are developing at breathtaking pace. The importance of DNA evidence is quickly recognized. In the USA, the genetic fingerprint is also being used more and more frequently to solve crimes. The expert Robin Cotton remembers the beginnings.
All of those early cases were very interesting because law enforcement agencies around the country wanted to use this technology, and because it was new and because it was more expensive than just doing the common blood or semen or saliva testing. They were doing it in cases that were locally important. And so the attorneys that were working on those cases, both on the prosecution side and on the defense, were often very, very good attorneys. And it was very interesting to work with those people in going to court and figuring out how to present this information to a jury.
The investigators working on the Sabina S. case in the late 80s still had to do without any DNA analysis. But 10 years later, in 1999, it was pure chance that helped them. At a psychiatric hospital in Germany, a patient caught the attention of the hospital staff more than once. His statements allude to the murder of Sabina S. By court order, he is forced to give a saliva sample. The DNA test, bullseye.
Evidence number 135 matched our evidence, and eventually the state court Hanau sent this person to prison for life.
The police had checked 190 suspects, a time-consuming investigation that finally ended with success. Detective Munch returns to the place where Sabina met her murderer.
Standing here today after 30 years, it's like yesterday, as if it happened yesterday.
A case the investigator had never been able to shake off. It was a tremendous load off his soul when the killer was finally caught.
For me, this means a sense of deep inner satisfaction. To have done something and have been successful in the end, the whole story. There have been other crimes, murders and manslaughter, or none of them has left such an impression, had such an impact on me than this one.
The interaction of police work and science led to the perpetrator. The successful use of DNA analysis in solving crimes has led to a rise in databases set up to store DNA samples. They contain information on crime scenes and convicted felons. This is important to quickly identify repeat offenders. But there is also criticism. When the DNA database is set up in April of 1998, concerns about insufficient data and privacy protection were voiced. A few years later, the first perpetrator was convicted on the basis of the database. Today, saving and storing crime-relevant trace evidence is common practice.
Every time I find DNA material at a crime scene that I believe to be relevant to the crime and I enter it into the database, this DNA sample is matched against the entire data set of the DNA analysis database and compares virtually all profiles stored in that database with the new one. If there's a match, it is displayed and this match has to be verified. There are several verification procedures. If this profile checks out, further investigations, or let's say further examinations, can be pursued or the perpetrator can be arrested. Our first match in the DAD was the case of Sebastian M.
On July 1st, 1996, in a forest close to Darmstadt in Germany, the body of a 13-year-old boy is discovered. The forensic team identifies the perpetrator's DNA. However, there is no profile match in the databases. Sometime later in Berlin, a career criminal is asked to volunteer a saliva sample for the DNA analysis database, and he agrees. In the course of a routine procedure, his genetic fingerprint is compared with DNA evidence from unsolved cases at Harald Schneider's lab, and it matches. Sebastian's murderer has been found.
The first big murder case that was cracked with the DAD. That was pretty exciting for us.
In 2018, At the 20th anniversary of the DNA analysis database, it holds almost 1.2 million DNA samples. Every month, nearly 8,500 new data sets are added because not leaving a trace is impossible. Even when the perpetrators wear gloves and masks, every human still sheds about 40,000 skin scales per minute. Nationally, the DNA analysis database works well. How is the international collaboration? Expert Robin Cotton welcomes the worldwide consolidation of DNA analysis databases.
The databases are different in each country or jurisdiction, and I think the same is true in the rest of Europe. The set of markers that were initially used for the current methods had some overlap with the US markers, but not a lot. So that's a problem because now you can't search the database with the whole profile. You can only search the database outside of your own country with a portion of the profile. That has really been rectified to a large extent in the last really 3 years.
Today, the number of comparable markers has been expanded in all databases. This increases the chances of a match. However, not all traces found at a crime scene are automatically connected to the crime. A very important point, says Harald Schneider.
Our methodology is getting more sensitive, of course, and that means we require less and less trace material to get a genetic fingerprint, which is also a drawback, since you can see every person at the crime scene that has left their DNA there. But not everybody that left DNA there is a suspect or is connected with the crime.
Today, these trailblazing advances are part of Harald Schneider's daily life. In particular, one development in DNA analysis is of invaluable importance for the biologist, the PCR method. As early as in the 80s, researchers can claim a breakthrough. They discover how to multiply DNA. The process is called polymerase chain reaction, PCR for short, and was to develop into one of the #1 tools in forensic genetics, starting in the early 90s.
In 1992-93, we started to establish PCR technology. That was a new technology back then, revolutionary. There was even a Nobel Prize awarded for this technology for its development. It allows us to extract enough genetic information from minimal amounts of DNA traces to make this DNA trace visible. Just imagine a copy machine, and you have a single DNA molecule, and this individual DNA molecule can be copied as often as you like, so that in the end, you have sufficient material to perform the subsequent examinations.
Humans shed 40,000 skin scales per minute. Schneider and his team have succeeded in isolating DNA from even these smallest of particles. Schneider's most spectacular catch is the case of Julia H. The 8-year-old girl was last seen near a playground in Biebertal in the state of Hesse at the end of June 2001. 5 days later, in the woods nearby the town, there has been a fire in that area of the forest. After putting out the fire, the firefighters discover the body of a child. Their worst fears come true. They have found Julia. Schneider and his colleagues will play a crucial part in convicting the killer. In the case of the Sacramento rapist, DNA evidence provided a decisive piece of information years after the crime series ended. The perpetrator was not only active in Sacramento.
2011, I am in my car driving, and I get a phone call from Sheriff Lou Blanis, who was a sheriff at the time, and he said, "Carol, we have just connected the DNA for the East Area rape cases to all of the homicide cases in Southern California." And my first thought was we knew he was going to kill.
The DNA secured at the crime scene was a match and proved that the 2 crime sprees were committed by the same man. The media have a new name for the perpetrator, the Golden State Killer. But who is he? The investigators are at a dead end. Today, the DNA expert Robin Cotton praises the foresight of the investigators back then.
The methods available from 1976 to 1986 had no DNA. There wasn't anything. So then you're back with testing other features of semen and saliva and blood. And so those tests wouldn't have been able to identify anybody, which is why it's absolutely amazing. And the people who were doing it had a lot of foresight to say, we have to save this evidence. Now I understand that there's a number of victims. So they had evidence from these victims. And when they did do the DNA test with relatively current methods, and they compared those results to the database, now the person isn't in the database.
To identify the perpetrator, the police officers have to resort to a ruse and investigate with the help of a clever trick. The investigators around Carol Daly are able to tie several crime sprees to the same perpetrator. That is a big and decisive leap ahead in their investigation. But who is this man? His acts are so brutal, the investigators have a hard time letting go. The perpetrator's acts are extremely sadistic. In the beginning, he assaults women who are alone at home. Then later, he also breaks into the homes of couples. He forces them to tie each other up. Then he takes the woman into the next room. After forcing the male victim to lay down tied up on his stomach, the perpetrator stacks cups and plates on the man's back and warns him that he can hear everything, and at the first sign of movement, he will kill the woman. There is no match to the perpetrator's trace in any of the police, FBI, or Interpol's database. For a long time now, the investigators have suspected that he might be one of their own.
Very early on, we suspected that the rapist may have had police training because he was so good at concealing his identity and knowing how to get away and how to escape. And then we thought we had the 2 military bases, McClellan Air Force Base and Mather Air Force Base, and we thought that he could have been military. And we were trying to tie the attacks in with maybe a deployment or where he was stationed. There was not one thing that was available to law enforcement at the time that was not tried to identify who the East Area rapist was.
The investigators are at the end of their rope. They have exhausted all available means, even though it is clear that it is one perpetrator that has committed more than 45 rapes and 12 murders at different locations in California. The identity of the killer remains unknown. The investigation is once again on a hiatus for several years. There are no new leads. Years later, things begin to move again in the investigations. On June 15th, 2016, the FBI goes public with police composite drawings of the perpetrator, and there is a $50,000 reward offered for tips leading to his capture. But nothing happens. Then the investigators come up with an idea. They expand their search beyond police databases, because genealogy databases also store millions of DNA samples.
From what I understand with the genealogy and the matching of the DNA is that they took samples of the DNA and went on a genealogy website.
A new and so far untested approach, and in the end, it will lead to the conviction of the Golden State Killer. But how can a genealogy database help find a murderer? In the case of young Julia H. from Germany, the police have no suspect on their radar at first, until a detective has the idea of evaluating the pictures taken by automatic radar speed traps around the location where the body was found, And indeed, one camera captured a picture of a car with a license plate from the same town where little Julia lived. Is the owner of the car her murderer? More and more cities worldwide rely on the use of surveillance cameras as an element of their public safety concepts. This method of searching for perpetrators with the use of moving pictures is called video forensics. Expert Robin Cotton knows video forensics is a controversial issue in the USA.
Video forensics is done a lot here in the States. Video, still camera, audio, and the essentially the video audio forensics is done by specialized groups who have specialized training. Almost all police have access to that kind of thing. It's very important. So there's that, right? How people feel about it, I'm not sure I'm exactly prepared to be a spokesman for how everybody feels about it. There's got to be a balance there because it is helping to identify people and solve crimes. On the other hand, the balance is, you don't want to feel like everybody can track all of your whereabouts up and down the street.
In the case of Julia, the picture of the suspect's car was the decisive clue. In a search of the suspect's house, the investigators find the remains of a rug that was almost completely destroyed by fire. The suspect tried to destroy any trace and suffered severe burns himself in the process. At Dr. Schneider's lab, the rug undergoes a thorough examination.
The firefighters put out the fire and doused the rug almost completely with water so that the chances of finding any of Julia's DNA were very slim due to the sensitivity of the DNA technology back then. We still tried to look for microscopically small traces of blood on the rug, then cut up this rug into countless small pieces and went over these pieces under a microscope. We then succeeded in identifying traces of blood smaller than 0.5 square millimeters across on 2 spots, and were able to match them clearly to Julia. This was a direct link from Julia to the house of the suspect. He was eventually found guilty, and that was the decisive clue in this case.
Half a square millimeter is sufficient, be it blood, hair, or a skin scale. This small amount is enough to extract sufficient DNA to identify the criminal.
I'm convinced that it is impossible to commit a crime without leaving traces at the scene. These traces need not necessarily be DNA traces. They could be information from a witness who saw you near the crime scene, and then you might not have an alibi. But normally, when you commit a crime, you will leave traces of your DNA. But often, DNA comes in small amounts, is very small, and it is hard for us to find. This is why we have to develop suitable methods to detect such small amounts. But forensics is making progress at all levels, so that I believe that we will find countless new possibilities to quickly identify perpetrators.
DNA analysis is not free of mistakes, or let's say, people who run these analyses are not immune to making mistakes. The most well-known case of a mishap in a DNA analysis is the case of Peggy. On May 7, 2001, a 9-year-old girl disappeared in Lichtenberg, Germany. 14 years later, parts of her skeleton are found. Shortly afterwards, the following news made the headlines. The DNA from Uwe Bonhard, member of the right-wing National Socialist Underground, was found on the remains of the girl, but then a false alarm. It was all a trace evidence transfer from a member of the task force on site. Several investigators worked on both cases, and one of them transferred Bonhard's DNA to the site where Peggy's body was found.
That was really a game-changing experience, to see that the great strength of this technology, its great sensitivity, is also its greatest weakness. You really see everything, everybody who was at the scene and left DNA. Among them, also people who had been at the scene before the crime or after the crime. You would see all of that if you weren't careful enough and used the appropriate disposable materials that are really DNA-free. But we've gotten to that point now.
The methods are becoming increasingly more accurate. Today, scientists can determine age, skin color, hair color, and height of a person on the basis of some trace of DNA, a genetic police composite sketch. Other countries are already using these expanded methods to narrow down the field of possible perpetrators. In Germany, DNA analysis in court proceedings is to be expanded in the future to include exterior characteristics such as eye, hair, and skin color, and the approximate age of a person. Details about the biogeographic background are still not admissible.
In 2-3 years, I'd like to be able to make statements about a genetic police composite, about the age of the person who left their DNA, and to say how old a trace at a crime scene is, to help differentiate traces relevant to the crime from those that are not. That's what I'd like to be possible in 3 to 5 years. We will have different technologies available to gain more information from DNA traces. And then, the old saying, a crime scene can talk, it just takes the suitable methods to make it talk, will take on a completely different meaning.
DNA phenotyping is the name of the process, considered the method of last resort among experts, because it is not a tool to identify individuals as you would do with your normal DNA analysis, but is meant to narrow down the group of people the perpetrator comes from.
You don't get far if you don't have a solid lead. Expanded DNA analysis could help. We wanted biogeographic background information, but that was taken out due to privacy issues. But you could put a court restriction on it, so it could only be used where you have nothing to go on.
But as far as the expanded DNA analysis is concerned, Germany is really catching up when compared to other countries. What is the situation with phenotyping like in the USA? For Robin Cotton, the use of an expanded DNA analysis is also an ethical question.
There are a few cases that have been done with phenotyping, but it's very, very limited. Politically, here in the U.S., it's like many other things that are political here in the U.S. It's all over the place. So if you talk to the police, they would like everything that you can hand them. Now, the problem with that is that they may or may not understand just how much information they're going to get. They may or may not understand how reliable that is. Like if you say somebody has light brown hair based on phenotyping, that's still a whole wide range of people. So I think the bigger concern is there are people who are specialists in bioethics. We need to be talking to those people. We need to be listening to those people, as do the attorneys and the police.
But phenotyping is not the only tool that helps narrow down the circle of possible perpetrators. In addition to the use of new scientific methods, different ways of obtaining DNA are also being discussed in the media and politics of the USA. The investigators on the Golden State Killer case were the first to go down the road of genealogy to identify a perpetrator. Carol Daly, however, wishes she would have had today's methods available back then.
When I think about DNA and how it is used today, it would have been wonderful to have gone back and had it at that time to work some of the rape series that we had in homicide cases. However, at the time I was working homicide, we solved about 96-97% of our homicides. And it wasn't until later, because most of them were family or neighbor related or relationship related, and we knew, who the suspect was. But later, when you started having your gangs and the warfares, of your gangs on the streets and the drive-by shootings and things, it became very much more difficult to identify who, the responsible people were. But DNA has led to dozens of other cases now being solved by the use of DNA. So it's a great, great tool.
Genealogy websites are among the most visited sites on the internet. How many people actually use the data banks to do research on their family is hard to say in numbers. One thing is certain: millions of DNA data sets are stored in these genealogy databases. One should remember, the USA is a country of immigrants, and many people send their DNA to those service providers to discover where their ancestors came from. Some of the databases are public. All DNA samples collected there are accessible. People who are looking for their relatives and willing to send their own DNA can get a result faster. The investigators in the Golden State Killer case also turned to these databases to do a family search. They are not looking for their relatives, but those of the perpetrator. And lo and behold, some of the people stored in the databases had family overlap with his DNA. Soon they found cousins 3 times or even further removed. They zeroed in on possible perpetrators. Eventually, the only one left is the former police officer Joseph D., the only person whose age, residency, and other crime-relevant conditions make him the possible perpetrator.
I can't even tell you the name of the website right now. And through that, they were able to identify family members, and through family members, they were able to work their way back and identify Joseph as the hysteria rapist.
The investigators are certain Joseph D. must be the Golden State Killer. All they need now is his DNA to match it to the samples collected at the crime scenes. But how can they do that? The police put together a surveillance team, and they follow every step D makes. The team succeeds in obtaining the man's DNA. It matches to all the collected traces in the Golden State Killer case. More than 30 years after the last crime, one of the most brutal crime sprees in California's history has been solved. On April 24, 2018, the alleged Golden State Killer is arrested in his house in Citrus Heights. For years, this man has been terrorizing people, and as Carol and her colleagues have suspected for a long time, he used to be a cop, knew exactly how to cover his tracks. Carol Daly remembers her relief when he finally landed behind bars awaiting his trial.
It was a huge relief. For 42 years, every time I went out my front door, I checked the neighborhood out. But I tell women, you do that. You leave your house, you look all around, and you make sure nobody is there. But consciously, the East Area Rapist never left my thoughts all of those years. And many times I had to leave the house in the middle of the night, and it was always leave the house, look around, get in the safety of my car, lock the door, and be on my way.
For the investigators of the Sacramento Police Department, the case is finally closed now. More than 40 years since he started with his crimes, the alleged perpetrator has finally been caught and the wheels of justice are in motion. In the USA, the discussion is ongoing about how to use the new possibilities offered by these genealogy databases. How does forensic expert Robin Cotton gauge the situation?
So now, if you have DNA left over, it can be typed with the massive panels that are used for ancestry, and now you can do some genealogy. But those things, too, of course, you're going to come down to families before you come down to a person, and now you're back in that area where bioethics is going to make a difference, and you need to pay attention to that. So that's happening, but we have a little ways to go. And those conversations, while they've started, aren't finished.
The chances of success are too high to not use these new possibilities. So far, more than 15 cold cases where killers couldn't be identified for a long time have been solved in the USA using genealogy. And anybody can end up in these databases, even without giving their consent, when immediate or more distant relatives send in their DNA. A balancing act. To what point do you use the new possibilities? Where to draw the line? In Germany, the Foundation for Expanded DNA Analysis aimed at a genetic police composite has already been set. One thing is already possible today: the use of so-called near matches from DNA mass screenings. Perpetrators can be identified through their siblings when databases are being matched. For Harald Schneider, the DNA analysis is the method for fighting crime. And the numbers are on his side.
We have several thousand database matches every year here in Germany, which help solve numerous crimes. Next to the conventional fingerprint database that has been around for years longer, this really is the most important crime-solving tool in police investigations.
Sooner or later, we'll get them all, says Harald Schneider. Considering the staggering speed at which these methods are developing, he might be right.